Okay, so we're going to make a Seder out of the Seder, Emiyat Hashem. If you've been to listen to any of my classes for the Haggadah over the last few years, I think there's probably a theme to them on some level that um, I think that often when it comes to the Seder and to the mitzvahs of the Seder night, there's a lot of Vertelach and Vartera and inspiration, which is all very good and very important. But I feel like often all of that would be enhanced manifold if people had a better grasp on sort of the core structure of what the Haggadah is all about, what the different details of the Haggadah and the Seder night are all about. For those Lubavitchers out there, you're all familiar that the Rebbe published a Haggadah, a very scholarly work, which in many ways was quite ahead of its time. And I think you could say that the Rebbe's commentary to the Haggadah is divided into three subsections. There's so many works been made on the Rebbe's Haggadah. I wish somebody would sort of do this, to sort of publish the Rebbe's Haggadah, split into three. One section is basically what we're going to be doing tonight, getting to the core crux, the halachic, and the history of each item in the Haggadah, what it's doing there, how did it get there, etc. The second one is Chassidus, meaning Divrei Torah, and things along those lines. And a third is specifically Chabad Minhagim. So the Rebbe kind of set the stage. The Rebbe was very into these type of things that we're going to be discussing tonight. Is certainly the type of things that many of them are discussed in the Rebbe's Haggadah, and even those that are not, it's certainly that approach to things. In preparing tonight's class, which will hopefully be the first of a couple, maybe two or three parts, I've used a number of different Sfarim. There's one Haggadah Shal Pesach by Rabbi Daniel Goldschmidt, who was also a very important scholar on the history and nusach of various parts of Tefillah. The Rebbe famously used his kinnis on Tisha B'Av, and he has many other Sfarim that are very useful. So his Haggadah I used, as well as a number of other Sfarim as well. And my hope is that tonight we'll get all the way from the beginning up till Manishtana, and that part two will pick up from Manishtana. It says in the Gemara that there is a mitzvah to distribute kloyos ve'egoizim to children on the Seder night. Kloyos ve'egoizim means nuts and roasted. The Mefarshim say it means roasted grains. Basically, it means treats. In those days, treats for kids would be roasted grains, whatever it is, and nuts. And it's a mitzvah to give this out to the children because we want to keep the children engaged. Now, the Alter Rebbe adds two words when he brings this idea that you should give the children kloyos ve'egoizim. He adds three words, which I at least as of yet, I have not seen them in any of the other poskim. That he says that this should be done, at least not explicitly, that he says this should be done koidem asiyas haseder, before you do the Seder. So it's interesting that Alter Rebbe adds those words. I'm not sure where exactly he gets it from. I haven't seen others note that addition of the Alter Rebbe, but I think that from asking around, it seems like a lot of families like, oh, if you say the Manishtana nicely, then you get a treat. But the way the Alter Rebbe presents it, it's almost the opposite of that. You're supposed to give the children the treats so that they remain engaged and ask the children nicely, and ask the questions and remain involved. In a number of ancient Haggadahs, specifically, I think if I recall correctly, Italian Haggadahs, but not only, the kloyos ve'egoizim, the treats for the children, are enumerated in the list of items that are placed on the plate or on the basket, as they describe it, that's brought to the Seder, what we call the Seder plate. So there's different minhagim that developed over the years of which items are found on that plate. So in some old Haggadahs, you even have these kloyos ve'egoizim mentioned as things that come to the Seder. It's part of the Seder to give the children these items. Now, an interesting thing is, we mentioned this in the morning class, the Rashbam describes kloyos ve'egoizim not as roasted grains and nuts, but he describes it, he says, I heard that in Spain they have a dessert, and this dessert is made out of kloyos ve'egoizim, and so that's the phrase is kloyos ve'egoizim. It's a specific type of dish that the Gemara was suggesting to use as a treat for the kids. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I found a dish called alaju, A-L-A-J-U, which is apparently was common as a dessert in medieval Spain, and it included nuts, roasted flour, and honey. Now, over here, the Gemara doesn't say anything about honey, but the interesting thing is that later on, where the Gemara says that you're not supposed to eat anything after the Afikoiman, which we'll get to hopefully in part 3 of this series, the Gemara gives an example of what would be a dessert: tamarim, kloyos, ve'agoizim. Tamarim are dates, so dates, the roasted grain, and nuts. So, according to the Rashbam's approach, perhaps tamarim, kloyos, ve'agoizim, dates, that's honey. Perhaps that was the Gemara's description of this ala Jew dish. Take it or leave it. I'm not sure about that. Okay. Anyway, be that as it may, the kloyos ve'agoizim, distributing, giving out candies to the kids, is part of a whole host of things that we do on the Seder night, Kadesha Yishalu, in order that the kids should ask. We want the kids to remain engaged. We want the kids to ask questions. Now, we're not yet talking about the specific questions that the kids ask, which is known today as the Manishtana. We'll get to that in part 2 of this series. But at this stage, we're just saying that we want the kids to remain engaged and we want the kids to ask. Now, the truth is, it's not only the kids that we want to remain engaged. We want the adults to stay engaged too. But hopefully the adults don't need tricks for you to keep them engaged. Hopefully the adults have the maturity and the understanding to stay engaged. But it's specifically to keep the kids engaged that we have to do all these sort of tricks on the outside to get them to maintain their attention. However, there is also the idea of specifically focusing on the children on the Seder night. There's a number of psukim, the mitzvah to tell the story to your child. Specifically, the pasuk says also, Ki yesholcha bincha, when your child will ask you. So this idea that the Seder is based around the question of the child already finds its source in Torah Shebeksav, in the Torah. And in the Rebbe's Haggadah, he brings, al pi Chasidus, that the emphasis on the child asking the questions arouses by God, so to speak, arouses by Hashem, the aspect of Kinar Yisrael v'oihavehu, that the Jewish people are compared to a young child, and Hashem loves the Jewish people like a young child, so that's why there's an emphasis on the young children. Now, as we go along, we'll see what some of the other things that we do on the Seder night specifically to interest the young children are. The irony of the whole thing is that nowadays, children are going to school, and for weeks, pretty much from straight after Purim and not earlier, they are learning about every detail that we're going to be doing on the Seder night. And so it kind of it's not really the case anymore that you do something which catches the kids off guard and says, hey, why are you doing that, right? The way the Gemara presents it, the way the Mishnah and the Gemaras and the Rishonim present it, is that you're doing things that the child is going to find strange. You don't usually do this, and that's going to cause him to ask, that's going to propel him to ask the questions. So that's not really the reality in today's day and age, where the kids go to school and they know already that you're going to do all these things. So it's kind of become more of a ritual than actually catching them off guard. But I think at the same time, every Kol Adam Yasa B'das, you try, as if you're leading a Seder and you have children, to do whatever you can to keep them engaged and to keep them interested, and to use it as an opportunity for chinuch. All right. The first thing we do when we get home is we set up the kaira, the Seder plate. Now, you could technically set up the Seder plate before Yom Tov, but Minhag Chabad is specifically that we don't do it that way, that we set up the Seder plate only after you come home, before you start the Seder, which of course, you're starting late, especially this year. It's Matzah Shabbos, the first Seder, so that takes another few minutes to set everything up. Now, the Mishnah says, I should really mention that really the last parak of Pesachim, the Mishnah's last parak of Pesachim, that is the bare bones of the Seder. Exactly what you do, why you do it, when you do it, how you do it, what you say, it's all there in that parak, which in many ways is really the sort of the basis for the Haggadah as we know it. So in order to really get to the crux of anything that you're doing, is you have to start by looking at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, they brought to him matzah, chazeres is the lettuce that you use for maror, charosis that you dip it in, and shnei tavshilin, and 2 cooked items. Now, what does it mean they brought before him? So once upon a time, in Mishnaic times, the way they had the Seder was that the Balabayas and the people were sitting on these couches, reclining on the couches, and there were these little tables, maybe something akin to a coffee table, or like you have in a bar, individual tables, and the table was brought in front of him. Now, the table was brought in front of the person leading the Seder after he made Kiddush, right? But nowadays, because it was not just after Kiddush, it was after Tibul Rishon, after the first vegetable, which we call karpas, which we're going to get to. That's when the Mishnah says to bring this table with all these items on it. However, nowadays that we don't have those small tables, so everything's on the table. So technically, you could say, prepare the Seder plate. It should be in the kitchen. You prepare it after you get karpas, then go and prepare the Seder plate. But Lamaisa, we don't do that because we don't have this idea with small tables anymore. We have big tables, so we set up what we call the Seder plate, which is the matzah and all the things on top of it. We set it up before we start the Seder, before Kiddush, which is a little bit of a change from the way it is in the Mishnah, and that change is because we no longer have those small personal tables. So if everybody's sitting around one big table, that's the sort of the most convenient way to do it, and so that's the basis for our minhag. Now, the way we have our kaira is that we have 3 matzahs, and on top of the matzahs, we have 6 items. Now, most of the 6 items, what are the 6 items? So the way we have it is you have the egg, the bone, the lettuce, the karpas, the charoises, the karpas, and the next set of lettuce. Now, the reason we do it in that shape, it's like a shape of 2 segels on top of each other. That is a Pi Kabbalah. It's based on the Arizals, and we're not going to get into the details of that right now. Now, I think it's true to say that of all the 6 items on the Seder plate, the 2 that are the most elusive are the bone and the eggs. Everybody knows what the lettuce is for marer and for kerech. Everybody knows what the karpas is for. Everybody knows what the charoises is for. But the 2 things that we put at the top, we put an egg and a bone, I believe are the most elusive. And so what I would like to do is, in this class, I'm going to explain about the bone and the egg, and the other things, the charoises, the lettuce, etc., we will touch upon them as we get up to them in the order of the Seder. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, there were 2 karbonis that were brought on the 14th of Nisan on Erev Pesach. The first one, and the primary one, was the Karban Pesach. In addition to that, there was a Karban Chagiga. We usually translate that it was a shlamim, a peace offering, a celebration offering, but the point is it was another karban that was brought, and the meat of it was eaten on the Seder night before eating of the Karban Pesach. Now, the Gemara, so first of all, the Brisa says that you bring, the Mishnah already says that you bring 2 tafshilin, you bring 2 cooked items. The Mishnah doesn't say why you bring 2 cooked items, right? But those 2 items, that what we do, the Mishnah doesn't say what the 2 cooked items should be either. It doesn't say what they are, it doesn't say why you bring them. Just says bring 2 cooked items. In practice, our minhag is to bring an egg and a cooked bone of a chicken. But the question is, why are we doing that? So let's go back to the beginning. The Brisa in the Yerushalmi says that the reason why you need to have 2 cooked items on the Seder plate is Zeicha lePesach and Zeicha leChagiga. There's 2 karbanis, 2 meat offerings that you would bring on the 14th of Nisan and eat on the Seder night. One is the Karban Pesach, the other is the Karban Chagiga. So corresponding to those 2 karbanis, you're supposed to bring on your Seder plate 2 dishes, 2 cooked foods. Now, the very same brisa as it's quoted in the Bavli doesn't say that. It just says to bring 2 tafshilin. And subsequently, in the way the Bavli records it, there is no Tanaic interpretation to the purpose or the meaning of the 2 cooked items, but the Gemara brings a whole host of Amiroim who do discuss what the purpose of these 2 cooked items is. And not what the purpose, but examples of what they should be. One of the examples which we'll mention is dog or beitza sha'alav, a fish, a piece of fish together with the egg that's on it. I guess it used to be common to cook, to serve not today, you serve a gefilte fish with a carrot on top. So a fish with an egg. And then in the Gemara, there's one opinion, which is the opinion of Rav Yosef, who says that the 2 dishes are corresponding to the 2 karbanis of Pesach and Chagiga. And he further says that therefore the 2 dishes have to be 2 types of meat, because they're corresponding to 2 karbanis, which are meat. So therefore the 2 dishes have to be 2 types of meat. What is the purpose of the 2 tavshilin according to the other Amirayim. In other words, the other Amirayim who says it could be bones or soup or a fish and an egg, whatever it is. What is the purpose of the shnei tavshilin? So, a number of commentaries and people who have written on this suggest that actually it's just the way. This is the food that you're eating. The Mishnah is describing you. The meal of the Seder. So you bring matzah, that's part of your meal, and all the food. What is the food that you're eating? Shnei tavshilin is synonymous with a meal, and they point out a number of other places in rabbinic literature where shnei tavshilin is a coined as a phrase for kind of a minimal meal. A minimum meal has two courses, two dishes. Yeah, so. For example, in the laws of Erev Tavshilin, Beis Shammai holds you have to have two Tavshilin because that's a meal. We don't pass it that way. We say one thing is enough. One cooked item is enough for Erev Tavshilin. We also have a baked item. But cooked item, Beis Shammai says you need two. Also in the laws of Tisha B'Av it comes up. So Shnei Tavshilin, according to the other Amirayim who just say it could be fish, an egg, or a soup, whatever it is, there's nothing ritualistic about it. It's just you need to have a meal. So your meal is your two cooked items. So according to that approach, really, the two things that you have on your Seder plate as the two cooked dishes, that is really the mainstay of what your meal, your Shulchan Aruch, is going to be. Perhaps, just one second, perhaps it's all even more than that because the Gemara records there was a practice of having a Gedima Kulas. The Gemara says you shouldn't have a Gedima Kulas to serve on the Seder night and roasted, to take a lamb as it is whole and roast it, a rotisserie lamb, yeah? So we don't do it because it shouldn't look like Korban Pesach. So that could also be that. Perhaps the Mishnah is saying that all you need for your meal is Shnei Tavshilin, any two cooked dishes. You don't need a big Gedi because you're not having a Korban Pesach, and so that's not necessary, or perhaps even you dafka shouldn't have it. You should just have two plain dishes, not a full goat as part of your Seder, so it shouldn't give the appearance of having a Korban Pesach without a Beis Hamikdash, or without, yeah.
No, the Shnei Tavshilin is just symbolic with what's going to be in the Shulchan Aruch.
Not according to that, it's not that they're symbolic. That is the Shulchan Aruch.
As far as the quantity and the kaira,
no, I don't think so. I think the way, according to that, the way it's done is you bring your kaira. Your kaira has your matzah, has your marer and your kairich, and it has your shnei tavshilin. It has the food that you're going to eat for Shulchan Aruch. It's not a small amount that's just symbolic, etc. Okay, now, so according to what I've said until now, if you want your two tavshilin to be corresponding to the Pesach and the Chagiga, it's supposed to be two types of meat. Now, the way we do the minhag, it's a little bit of what we call a stira minei obey. It doesn't really add up because on the one hand, we definitely do say that our two tavshilin, our egg and our bone, correspond to the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga. So, for example, we are makbid not to eat the bone. Don't eat the bone at all. And in fact, in Chabad, there's even further hakbada that you remove the meat we take the neck of the chicken and you remove most of the meat. You don't remove all the meat because the halacha is it has to be a piece of cooked food. So if you removed all the meat and you're just left with the bone, then that wouldn't count as a tavshil. But we remove most of the meat and we don't eat it. Why? Because there is this idea that nothing that you do should appear as if you are bringing a Korban Pesach in Chicago, and so. Because even though a korban would have to be meat, and this is chicken, it's poultry, but to stay a million miles away from anything that could appear as though you were actually doing a korban, we make sure to remove the meat from it, and we also make sure not to eat it, right? So we are definitely considering our egg and our bone to be corresponding to the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga. But yet we don't take two pieces of meat, we take a bone and an egg. Now, why we don't take two pieces of meat, despite maintaining that it is corresponding to the Pesach and Chagiga, we're not going to get into that tonight. I actually do have a whole theory about it, but it would get too sidetracked and we won't have time to cover what we need to cover, so we're going to leave that question unanswered for now. But what I do want to focus on is why we do take an egg and a bone. What's up with an egg and a bone? So, the way the Alter Rebbe records this, of course, this is nothing new for him from the Alter Rebbe. I'm just reading it as the Alter Rebbe phrases it. The custom is already from the early generations. That the meat should be from part of an animal that is referred to as zeroya, arm. Lezecher shaga'olam HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'zroya netuya, because to remember, is everything okay there, Ari? To remind us that Hashem, as a symbol of Hashem taking us out of Egypt, bizroya netuya, with an outstretched arm. V'hasheni beitza, and the second one should be an egg. Why an egg? Lefisha beya b'lashon Arami, because the word for egg in Aramaic is beya, and the word beya also means to desire or to want. Koloimar, so we have the egg and the arm. Koloimar, meaning to say, the bar Achmana lemifrak yasana b'dra meramama, that Hashem wanted to redeem us with an outstretched arm. So want and arm are alluded to in the egg and the bone. This is quoted b'shem the Yerushalmi, b'shem the Medrash, in numerous Rishonim, and that's how the minhag is, as far as I know, by all communities in Klal Yisrael, that we have an egg and a bone. Now, in practice, the minhag is to take a bone, specifically the neck of a chicken. And I saw somebody, Rabbi Benish, who's a contemporary, who has a very nice sefer on the Haggadah, who suggests, why do you take a bone? Why do you take the neck of a chicken? Because the neck of a chicken in Rabbinic Hebrew is called the mafrekes, and the mafrekes is the same word, the same sound as lemifrak, to redeem. So if you're saying Hashem wanted to redeem us with an outstretched arm, so it adds nicely to the puzzle if you add in specifically the neck of a chicken, which is mafrekes. Okay, cute vart. Now, there are numerous other reasons suggested, in addition to this idea that the egg in Aramaic has the word is the same as that Hashem wanted to redeem us. There are a number of other reasons suggested as a reason to use an egg, and I'm going to go through a number of them right now. Okay, so first of all, the Ramah writes in Taf Ayin Vav, in some places it's the minhag, in the meal of Shulchan Aruch at the end of the Seder, to eat eggs, as a commemoration of mourning. What's the connection to mourning? So eggs is a round thing. Minhag is you give a mourner a round thing. Why are you mourning on the night of the Seder? So you could say you're just mourning. Okay, so he says two. Says about two reasons. Number one, because the night of the first Seder is always the same night of the week as Tisha B'av, so there's that connection. In addition, because as a commemoration to the Churban, to the desecration. In other words, we come to the Shulchan Aruch and we see we don't have a Korban Pesach, so that reminds us of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and there is an element of mourning. So that is the reason for eating an egg at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Ramah doesn't say that this is why you have an egg on the Seder plate. He says this is the reason why you should start your meal, or why in your meal you should have an egg. But it's not a far stretch to say that that's also a reason to have an egg on the Seder plate, especially, as we said before, that the way the Mishnah presents it, it's that the foods that are on the Seder plate are the foods that serve as your meal. So it's not a far stretch at all. Nevertheless, in the Rebbe's commentary on the Haggadah, the Rebbe the Rebbe rejects this as being an idea for, the Rebbe rejects this idea as being the reason or a reason for choosing an egg. Now, I don't really understand what the Rebbe is saying over there, and this was a very, I'm not the only one who didn't understand it. There's a lot been written about this, first of all by the Rebbe himself. There's a lengthy correspondence between the Rebbe and Rav Zevin of Shlomo Yosef Zevin, specifically on this comment, where Rav Zevin pushed back against what the Rebbe wrote, and the Rebbe responded, and it went up and back a couple of times, and this has been written about in various journals over the years. The bottom line is, I don't really understand what the Rebbe is saying, so I'm not going to attempt to explain it, but the Rebbe does not accept this as a possible reason for the minhag of an egg. Another reason suggested in some Rishonim for the reason to give an egg is because it's a reminder of Nichum Avelim. In other words, part of the whole idea of the Exodus is we say that the Exodus of Egypt takes us out from a state of mourning into a state of celebration. So what do you do when when you are comforting a mourner and trying to make him more happy, you give him an egg. So that's a reason to have an egg on the Seder plate. Another reason brought in some Rishonim is that the reason why they chose an egg, listen to this, is because an egg is easily available to everybody and it's very easy to cook. And so accordingly, perhaps this year we shouldn't be having eggs because I don't know that they're readily available to everybody. But the truth is that jokes aside, there is actually a halachic reason not to have an egg this year, and that is on the first Seder, because we already said that we're taking the two tafshilin corresponding to the Korban Pesach and to the Korban Chagiga. When was the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga brought? On the 14th of Nisan. That's only if it falls on any day of the week. But if the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbos, as it does this year, there was no Korban Chagiga brought. So accordingly, this year at the first Seder, it would make sense that we should not have an egg corresponding to the Korban Chagiga, right? Because there is no Korban Chagiga on Shabbos. But nevertheless, Tosfos says that that's not the case. Tosfos says we do have a two tafshilin even on a year where the Seder is on Matzah Shabbos, and Tosfos says that that if you would avoid having an egg when it's Matzah Shabbos, so people will think that the egg is actually a carbon, right? So it's kind of, we want to keep the symbolism. And if you don't do it on Matzah Shabbos, you might end up not doing it another day of the week. So the bottom line is that even when eggs are expensive and there's bird flu and there's Matzah Shabbos, nevertheless, we still insist on an egg at your Seder plate. Now, there is a sefer by the name of Keser Shem Tov. Keser Shem Tov, not from the Baal Shem Tov, it's another sefer by a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin, I think. He lived in London. He was a rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese, the Bevis Marks Shul in London, and he wrote a 3-volume work, if I recall correctly, on liturgy, on the Seder and prayer. The Rebbe quotes him a number of times. It's hard to know with him if he means what he's saying seriously. I think sometimes he says things at least somewhat in jest. So I'm not sure if he meant this seriously or not, but he suggests what will now be a 5th reason to take an egg for the Seder, and that is that the Ibn Ezra writes on the pasuk Kisei Avas Mitzrayim, Hey Nizbach Estoy Avas Mitzrayim. The Ibn Ezra says that the Egyptians and many of the pagan cultures of the time were vegetarian. They did not eat anything that came from animals, and so Hashem makes the Jewish people in Egypt take a sheep to eat meat, to sort of rid themselves of any pagan leanings. So Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin is suggesting that perhaps the reason to take egg and a bone is to take dafka items that come from animals to make sure we're not secretly harboring any pagan vegetarianism. Now, there's one more absolutely fascinating reason to take an egg on the Seder night, which I had to share with you. In a number of Sfarim, it says that you take an egg mishum ziz. You take an egg on the Seder night because of ziz. What in the world is ziz? So, ziz, there's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, the ziz sodai imodi, which means a very, very big bird. It's described in the Gemara in Bava Basra, which is in the Agadah of Rabbi Bar Chana, so it's an Agadah that says a lot of things that are certainly not intended to be taken literally, but there it's described as a bird who stands on the ground and the head pierces the heavens. So this is a huge bird, and it's alluded to in Tehillim as the Ziz Sadai, and it's also known as another bird which appears in rabbinic teachings known as the Bar Yuchni. Now, what do we know about this Bar Yuchni other than it being massive? So there is a very famous meal that Hashem is going to make for the Jewish people when Mashiach comes. And this meal consists of the Shoir Habar and the Livyasan. What is the Shoir Habar and Livyasan? A massive ox and a massive fish. Well, that's the way the story is recorded in the Gemara. But in some Midrashim, the Suda that Hashem makes for tzaddikim in the time to come also includes a third item. We have the massive ox, we have the massive fish, and it also includes the bar yuchni, the ziz, this massive bird. So there's a massive meat, massive fish, a massive bird. And so this is the name of this bird is the yuchni, the bar yuchni, otherwise known as the ziz. According to in Tehillim, it's referred to as the ziz, ziz sadai modi. And so that's the meaning of this iteration of the minhag, to take an egg mishum ziz, because it is corresponding to the bar yuchni of, well, that is part of when Mashiach comes. Now the truth is that in a number of early Sfarim, specifically Italian Haggadahs, it says that you bring 3 tafshilin. The Mishnah says 2 tafshilin, 2 cooked items. But in many Italian, if I recall correctly, this is primarily from Italy, the minhag was to take 3. So they understood the Mishnah of 2 as being a bare minimum, but 3 was also good. And it's interesting because nowadays we have Ashkenazim and we have Sfardim, but we don't really have very much of Italian Jewry as a sort of a community on its own. But once upon a time, Italy was its own. There was Sfardim, there was Ashkenazim, and then there was Italy. It was a separate thing. So the Italian minhagim, for the most part, they're much more rare to see in observance than typical Ashkenazi or Sfardim minhagim. But in a number of Italian Haggadahs, it describes at the beginning of the Seder that you bring a piece of fish and a piece of meat and an egg. So that matches up with the 3 things. These are the 3 ingredients of the Suda of Mashiach. The meat corresponds to the Shei HaBar, the fish corresponds to the Levyasan, and the egg corresponds to the Bar Yuchni, the Ziz. The interesting thing is that there's a Gemara in a number of places, it's in Bechorus and in Menachos, which talks about the special quality of a Bar Yuchni and how it lays its eggs. Now, without getting into the details of that, the idea that the Bar Yuchni is specifically sort of recognizable or associated with its unique way of laying eggs would also feed into this tradition that the reason we have the egg on the Seder plate is to remind us of the egg of the Bar Yuchni, which is associated with the future redemption. So there you have it. Another reason to have an egg on your Seder plate is because it is a reminder of Mashiach, and according to the way we do it, that the bone has also come from a bird. So maybe that's another association with the Bar Yuchni, although, of course, I think till today there are some people who don't necessarily take a bird bone, and certainly in a lot of the pictures that you see of the Seder plates in modern art, the bone is not the neck of a chicken, it's more representative of the bone of an animal. I see you nodding your head. Is your custom to use a bone of a meat? Huh?
I think a bone of a lamb.
You take a bone of a lamb, yeah? So it's shank bone. Shank is yeah, okay, good. So that minhag exists as well. All right. Then on the Seder plate we have morer and charosos and karpas. We'll elaborate on all those things, why we're using lettuce, why we're using chrein, how we make a charosos. Yetz Hashem, it is the intention to elaborate on those as we get to them. And now we're ready to start the Seder with Kaddish. Now when you pick up your cup to make Kiddush, so you're doing a double thing. First of all, you're making Kiddush, like there's a mitzvah to make Kiddush every Yom Tif. But in addition, this is also the first of the 4 cups of wine, which is a special mitzvah for the Sederite, corresponding to the 4 Lashonos of Geula, the 4 expressions used to describe the redemption. Now, after Kiddush, we say Shechayonu. The women have already said Shechayonu when they lit candles. The men say Shechayonu as part of Kiddush, and it's noteworthy to bear in mind that there's another mitzvah that you have done, or that you have done, that you only do once a year, and you didn't say Shechayonu, which is strange. Usually if there's a mitzvah that you only do once a year, or like shaking lulav, which you only do on Sukkot, so 7 times a year, but 6 times a year. But you say Shechayonu. You say Shechayonu when you read the Megillah. You say the Shechayonu when you light the menorah, the Chanukah candles. So why don't you say Shechayonu when you do the mitzvah of B'dikas Chametz? So it says in Shulchan Aruch that the reason you don't say Shechayonu when you do B'dikas Chametz is because the Shechayonu of Kiddush covers the B'dikas Chametz that you did the night before, or this year 2 nights before. Okay? Now, in addition to Kiddush, this year, as the first Seder falls on Matzah Shabbos, we have Yak Nahaz. Yak Nahaz is the combination of Kiddush and Havdalah. So you start off with the Yud stands for Yayin, that's the bracha of Beir Priya Gofen. The Kuf stands for Kiddush, that's the bracha of Kiddush. Then you have Ner, the candles, which the Chabad minhag is that you don't look at your fingers to the candles on Yom Tov. You just look at the candles and say the bracha Beir Meir Ha'esh. Others do have the minhag to look at the candles. Then you say Hey Havdalah, and then you say Zayin Zman Shechiyanu. Why do we do Kiddush before Havdalah? The Chayra, you should say first Havdalah. Havdalah is saying goodbye to Shabbos, right? And Kiddush is greeting Yom Tif. So Shabbos comes before Yom Tif. The Chayra would make more sense to say Havdalah before Kiddush. So the Rashbam explains that if you make Havdalah first and then Kiddush, it looks as though you are eager to get rid of the burden of Shabbos. And so first we say Kiddush to welcome in Yom Tif, and then so to speak at the last moment, that's when we say goodbye to Shabbos. And as I've mentioned a number of times here, on Shabbos afternoon, we are learning Torah between Mincha and Ma'ariv, the end of Shabbos. It's not the way of Hasidim to rush to daven Ma'ariv the second the clock strikes. Of course, it's a shul, and you have to have organized it, and Ma'ariv has to start on time, or whatever it is, but also there's also some value to not rushing the moment Shabbos is over to rush to daven Ma'ariv. Okay, that's Kiddush, and of course, everybody has their own cup. You could do it in two ways. Either everybody could recite their own Kiddush, Mendel is making noise, or one person could say Kiddush loud while everybody holds their cups. Either way is fine. Okay, now, the next thing that we're getting towards is karpas, but in order to do karpas, we first do orchatz. Orchatz is washing your hands. Now, why are you washing your hands? Because before you eat a vegetable dipped in water, or before you eat a wet vegetable, or wet anything for that matter, you're supposed to wash your hands. This is nothing unique to Pesach. Anytime year-round, if you're eating a pickle, you're supposed to wash your hands, as you do for bread. According to Minhag Ashkenaz, you don't make a bracha, but anytime you eat something wet, if you're dipping your cake into your coffee or your milk, you're supposed to wash your hands. However, for various reasons throughout the year, some people might not be so strict about this, but on Pesach, there is a special emphasis that we do it, and the reason is, in order, again, this is one of the changes perhaps that you do in order to keep the kids engaged. You want the kids to ask, why are you doing things differently? Now, the truth is that when the kid asks, why are you doing this, you don't necessarily have a good answer. In other words, it depends what the question is. If the question is, why are you eating matzah? Well, then you have a good answer, because matzah is part of this Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim. But if he asks you, why are you washing and you don't usually wash, or number, as we'll see as we go along, other things that we do different that we don't usually do, you don't have a good answer. You don't have a good answer why you're giving out candies before the meal, right? But the point is that you want him to ask that question, because by asking questions, he remains engaged, and then hopefully he's also going to ask the relevant questions, which is, why do you have matzah? Why do you have marer? Why do you have Korban Pesach? Etc. Now, the word urchatz, it's urchatz and wash. So really the word is rechatz, right? But we say urchatz because there is a simon Seder Pesach, right? So there is this simon, this, what's the word, mnemonic? Is that the word? To remember the 15 steps of the Seder, Kadesh or urchatz, right? So in that Seder, in that simon, all of the words have two syllables, Kadesh, karpas, yachatz. So in order for rechatz to have two syllables, has to be preceded by urchatz, right? Urchatz, so therefore everything has two syllables, and it matches up nicely. Now, I would imagine rachatz is, the rachatz is not grammatically correct. It would have to be rachatz with a shava, which is not really considered its own syllable in Hebrew poetry. Now, the truth is that we're all familiar with Kadesh or Chatz, that simon. But there are numerous other versions of the simon that were popular in different communities at different times. I once read an article who had a list of, I don't remember how many, but tens of different versions of a simon for all the steps of the Seder night. Right? Now, what we see from here is that whether you have the Kadesh or Chatz simon or a different simon that you use, the fact is there's a simon. In other words, that is throughout the history of Klal Yisrael, it's been important that there's structure and there's detail and there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of minhagim and there's a lot of halachas and there's a lot of reasons and there's a lot of symbolism and there's a lot of structure. And that structure is an integral part of the Seder, and that's why, whereas in other Yom Tovim you don't have this so much, that there's a simon to sort of what all the things that you're going to do. On the Seder night, there's always a simon, whether it's Kadesh or Chatz, a different one, there's a simon to what you do. The Maharil writes, and the Rebbe quotes this in his commentary on the Haggadah, Yehei kol adam chored be'ema, a person should be trembling with fear, to keep the words of the Chachamim, who instituted the mitzvah of the Seder night and the reciting of the Haggadah. No element of the Haggadah should be kal be'enov, should be light in your eyes. In other words, this, I don't really relate, I don't really connect. I would prefer to tell the story of the Exodus in a different way. It would be more meaningful to say this and not to say this. Even if there may be, says the Maril, some things in the Seder that it appears to you that it's not so significant, Yaskil B'daita, you should be clever, to keep everything that you're supposed to do. There is nothing empty, there is no detail of all the rituals and the minhagim that we do on the Seder night that doesn't have a very exact purpose and definition and meaning, etc. All right, so you've made kiddush, you've washed, and now it's time for karpas, for the dipping of the vegetable. Now, in the Mishnah, this step of the meal of the Seder is described as Hevio lefanav, so they're serving him, metabil b'chazeres, and he dips with chazeres. Now, chazeres is lettuce, which is also used for maror. So you're dipping your lettuce. Now, there are a number of different opinions and approaches to what this is all about, why are we doing this. It's an absolutely fascinating study and discovery. What I'm going to do tonight is present two different approaches to it, as they are in the Rishonim, pretty much. Perhaps you could call this the approach of the Rashbam and the Rambam. I don't know if that's exactly the correct definition, and there's certainly other Mefarshim and other Rishonim on each side of this. And again, I'm only presenting two. There are probably more than two, and certainly within the two there's different nuances, but we're going to focus on giving two different approaches to karpas. First of all, the vegetable that the Mishnah says you use for this step of the Seder, obviously we haven't yet used the word karpas. The Mishnah says to use lettuce. Now, the way the Gemara explains this is that the Mishnah doesn't mean that you should specifically use lettuce. It means that even if all you have is lettuce, so you may have thought that you shouldn't be eating lettuce now because you got to keep the lettuce for later for the mitzvah of maror. Nevertheless, you should eat the lettuce now as well, because it's important to have a vegetable now. If you have a different vegetable, it's fine to use a different vegetable. We'll see soon that in the second approach, according to the Rambam, there's actually a preference to use lettuce. But for now, let's just say the Mishnah says chazeres, but we're just going to understand this as meaning any vegetable. Now, in the Rishonim, it's brought that the minhag is to use a vegetable called karpas. Why karpas? Because karpas spells out the word samach perach, which alludes to the back-breaking labor that 600,000 Jews had to do, and therefore you should use the vegetable called karpas, which is celery. So you're supposed to use celery for karpas. Now, l'maisa nowadays, certainly the Chabad practice is not to use celery. We use an onion. Some people use a potato. Other people, I believe, do use celery. But nevertheless, we still call it karpas, even though karpas means celery, and we're using an onion. But this step of the Seder has become known as karpas. When you make the bracha on the karpas, you're supposed to say a Borei Pri Hadama and have in mind that bracha covers the maror. And the reason for that is because there is a question whether or not you should make a bracha on the maror or not. So to cover yourself, you say Borei Pri Hadama now, covering the maror. In fact, there is one of the Rishonim, and I'm forgetting right now who it is, but it definitely says it's one of the Rishonim, that the entire purpose of karpas is in order to give you an excuse to say a Borei Pri Hadama that will cover the maror later. The Rashbam understands the whole karpas thing to be as follows. You with us, Rabbi Ruvain? The Rashbam understands it as follows. He says, the whole purpose of karpas is to do something strange to get the kids to ask questions. That's how he understands the Gemara. Now again, you're doing something strange, you don't have a good answer for it. There's no good reason why you're doing it. The only reason I'm doing it is to keep you, the little child, to keep you on your toes, seeing all these strange things that I'm doing. What is the strange thing that you're doing? You're eating a vegetable. Now, according to the way the Rashbam explains it, the dipping is almost by the way. It's not, in English, there's a word, I looked this up, metonymy. Does anybody know what metonymy means? So, metonymy is a figure of speech where a concept is referred to by something closely associated with it, but it's not really the thing. So, for example, one of the examples of this is when you say you need boots on the ground, right? When you say you need boots on the ground, you don't mean that you don't mean that you need footwear. You mean that you need people, right? But you're referring to the boots that those people are wearing as a metonymy for you need people, right? So, according to the Rashbam, we say dipping is because normally when you want vegetable, like now, normally when you have a salad, you have dressing on it. So we're used to you have salad, you pour the dressing on the salad, and you take a fork and you dig in. But the ancient way of doing that was you had a dip, and then you took the vegetable and you dipped it in. So the Mishnah is telling you eat a vegetable, right? It says dipping, but that's not the point. The point is eat a vegetable. Why should you eat a vegetable? Because you got to do something very strange for the children. What's strange? Usually, what do you do after you make kiddush? You start your meal. How do you start your meal? By eating the bread or the matzah in this case, right? Here, before you start the meal, you're serving salad. That's strange, right? So according to the Rashbam, that is the strange thing that you're trying to do. Now, accordingly, what is the first question of the Manishtana? In Chabad, it's still the first question of the Manishtana. In most other minhagim today, it comes later on in the Manishtana, but in the Mishnah, this is recorded as the first question. The question is, the way we say it is that in all the nights of the year, we don't dip even once, and tonight we dip twice, right? The way this Mishnah is found in what is considered to be accurate versions of the Mishnah is that in all the nights of the year, we dip once, and in the Seder, we dip twice. What does this mean? This fits very well with the Rashbam. Dip means we eat vegetables, or let's translate that into 2025 language, we eat salad. So, on all the nights of the year, we have salad once. When do you have salad? As part of the meal. Tonight, we're dipping twice. Tonight, we're having an extra salad before you started the meal. That's strange, right? So, according to the Rashbam, what is the definition of karpas? Having salad before the meal. What's the purpose of it? Because it's a strange thing to do to have the salad before the meal, and so that's going to keep the kid on his toes, paying attention. Why are you eating salad before the meal? Part of what makes it strange is that originally karpas meant you have, or tibble meant you eat vegetables. But there's a later machlokus rishonim whether or not you need to say burn nefashos. After you eat the vegetables, do you say burn nefashos? Do you say an after blessing or not? So in order to avoid getting into that problem, the minhag became that you specifically eat less than the kazayas. You just have a tiny amount. Yeah. So it kind of loses this whole feeling of like it doesn't even look to the kid as if you're eating salad anymore. It looks as if you're doing some ritual and having a tiny bite of celery or lettuce or potato. It's not again. So it kind of the nature of what karpas is, rather than being a salad course that you could munch on while you're saying the Haggadah, yeah, it's become a sort of you just have a tiny bit. That is approach number one. That is the approach of the Rashbam. The second approach, which we're going to refer to as the approach of the Rambam, is that what's strange to the child is not that you're eating salad before the meal. In fact, on the contrary, according to the scholars today, that was the norm. In those days, the norm was that a festive meal started that before you brought the main course, you had salad, which could have been vegetables and fruits and other things as well. And he brings that in the Yerushalmi. It was also vegetables and fruits and all sorts of other things that were served as part of this first step of the Seder. And so what's strange about this is not that you're serving salad now. What's strange about it is that you're having vegetables twice. In other words, you have your salad before the Seder, you have your vegetable before the Seder, and then you bring vegetables again for Marer, right? So the purpose, according to the Rambam, the purpose of the karpas before is so that later when you get to the Marer, it's more obvious and evident to the child that this is not just another salad, this is a special thing, and he's, oh, why is it special? Oh, that gives you an excuse to talk about the mitzvah of eating Marer. So according to the Rambam, it's not the first, what we're trying to bring the child's attention to is not the vegetables before the Seder. On the contrary, it's by eating vegetables before the Seder that brings the child's attention closer to pay attention to the vegetables that you eat at the end of the Seder, and he realizes that that's actually Marer, and it's a mitzvah to do so. Indeed, in Perek Zayin of Hilchos Chametz and Matzah, the Rambam gives you a list of a number of things that you do in order to, that the entire purpose of them is in order to keep the child asking questions, and Karpas or Tibul Rishon does not appear on that list. So it seems quite clear that according to the Rambam, this first eating vegetables is not there to make the kids ask what you're doing. It's there to help the kids pay better attention so that when you're eating maror, he notices. And according to the Rambam, it actually makes sense what the Mishnah says, that you do chazaris. In other words, you could do any vegetable, but it's much better if you do chazaris, if you do lettuce, because if you eat lettuce before the meal, if you ate potatoes before the meal and then you serve lettuce during the meal, so that doesn't seem as striking to the child. But if you served lettuce for the first tibble, and then you're serving lettuce again for maror, that's even more striking to the child. Why are you serving lettuce twice? And then you get the opportunity to tell him that it's because of maror. Now, we know that there are 4 questions on the Seder night. Now, the 4th question is that the rest of the year we eat upright, and on the Seder night we recline. I'm going to leave that question for now. Let's just focus on the first 3. What are the first 3 questions? So, the way it is in the Mishnah, the first 3 questions are, why do you dip? Why do you have matzah? Why do you have maror? I'm sorry, why do you have matzah? Why do you have carbon pesach? Why do you have roasted meat? Right? So that fits very nicely. There's 3 primary mitzvahs of this night, Pesach, matzah, and maror, and those are represented in the 3 questions that the Mishnah gives you. Right? Now, that fits well according to the Rambam. According to the Rambam, the question about dipping is maror. Why are you dipping? Why are you having vegetables twice? In other words, why are you having maror? You've already served the salad before. Why are you serving it again? So according to the Rambam's approach, that fits very nicely. And in the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah, that's the girsa that the Rambam accepts. That the 3 questions of the Mishnah are tibul, which according to the Rambam, the question is, why are you having maror? Matzah and carbon pesach. Those are the 3 questions in the Mishnah according to the Rambam. The problem is that the way we have it, and the way the Rambam writes it in Mishnah Torah as well, there's we take out the question of carbon pesach because we don't have the carbon pesach anymore, but we do have the question of maror. So according to the Rambam, the 4 questions in the Mishnah Torah, the 4 questions are. The last question is why we recline. So again, I said we're not discussing that right now. The first 3 questions, according to the Rambam Mishnah Torah, are why do you dip? Why do you have matzah? And why do you have maror? According to the Rambam, question 1 and question 3 are pretty much the same thing. So that is a question that remains, to me at least, unclear exactly how we understand that. And either way, both according to the Rashbam and according to the Rambam, the way we say Manishtana is strange, because we say that the whole year we don't even dip once, and on this night we're dipping twice. So it's as if the emphasis is on why are you dipping twice? That's not the question according to the Rashbam, and it's also not the question according to the Rambam. According to the Rashbam, the question is, why are you serving salad before the meal? According to the Rambam, the question is, why are you dipping a second time? The way we say it, that the whole year we don't dip at all, and this year we're dipping twice, makes as if like, why are you dipping twice? That is the question. So the way the Manishtana is said, Lamaisa and our Minhag, does remain a little bit unclear. And again, in contemporary scholarship, there's a lot of discussion tracing the history of exactly how it came to be. The Minhag to say it that the way we do it today, but for now, we're just going to leave it at that.
Doesn't it fit with the Rambam?
Why does it fit with the Rambam? No, well, there's 2 problems with the Rambam.
We dip twice.
No, it should say, and all other night, according to the Rambam, the question should be 2 things. First of all, according to the Rambam, the question should be, on all other nights, we dip once. Whatever. The bigger problem according to the Rambam is the second point. According to the Rambam, the bigger problem is that you're asking tibul and maror, which are both the same question.
Right.
That's the bigger question according to the Rambam.
Right, but it's the first part of it where it says that we don't even dip one time, and that's irrelevant to the point.
That's a change, because the original nusach was the rest of the year we dip once, now we're dipping twice. But then the shteger, the norm became that the rest of the year we also don't dip anything. We have salads and that. So we changed it to say we don't even dip once. But what comes out is that the emphasis is almost on like, why are you dipping twice? So that becomes a bit strange. Okay, the next step in the Seder is Yachatz. Now, Yachatz is breaking the middle matzah. This does not appear explicitly in Chazal anywhere that you have to break a matzah at the Seder. The Mishnah says parperes hapas, which some say means breaking the bread, but that's certainly not the pshat, the simple, straightforward meaning of the Mishnah. It doesn't say anywhere explicitly in Chazal that you have to break bread at the Seder. However, the Gemara does say that matzah is referred to as lechem oini, the bread of the poor man, and the Gemara says matar kushaloni beprusa, that a poor man doesn't have a whole loaf of bread; he just gets the scraps, so he has a broken loaf of bread. So that's why you're supposed to have a broken piece of bread at the Seder. But that doesn't mean that you would have to do it at the Seder. You can take a broken piece of bread and put it on the plate. But the breaking it at the Seder is a later development. Now the interesting thing is that we don't make a bracha or anything when we say yachatz, but I saw somebody contemporarily suggest that what do you do immediately after yachatz? You say, hey lach ma'anyo, this is the bread of the poor man. So it's almost like, just like when you say, when you have koirech, you announce, kach asa Hillel, I'm about to do the sandwich of Hillel, right? So the same is true perhaps of yachatz, that you break the matzah and then you say, halach ma'anyo, now that I've broken it, I have the bread of the poor man. Okay. Once you've broken the matzah in half, what do you do with it? So the bigger half you put away for the afikoyman. Why the bigger half? Because the bigger half is more prominent, and afikoyman is prominent. It's the crown jewel of the Seder, in a way, because it represents the Karban Pesach. So you put away the bigger half for the afikoyman. By the way, I'll just mention, we'll talk more about afikoyman when we get there, but what does the word afikoyman actually mean? So the Rishonim say that it is different suggestions. The most common one is that afikoyman means it's like Aramaic, afiko mon, bring out food, afiko, bring out mon, food. So they say that's what it means. However, and in the Musaf HaAruch, which we discussed recently, and the Rebbe actually quotes this in the Haggadah as well, later scholars already realized that afikoimon is actually a Greek word and it means dessert. So that's the meaning of the word afikoimon. What do you do with the smaller piece of the matzah? So you put it back in between the two matzahs. Why do you put it in between the two matzahs? So it needs to be on the table because we said before, matzah. Another interpretation the Gemara gives for lechem oini, the bread of not the bread of the poor man, but the bread of oini. It's the bread over which you announce or declare things. So you're going to declare the Haggadah over this piece of matzah. So that's why this piece of matzah you have to leave it on your table to say the Haggadah over it. Why do you put it in between the two matzahs? So as we'll see later, the first matzah, the top matzah, is the bracha, is the matzah over which you say hamaitzi. The middle matzah is the matzah which you eat for the mitzvah of achilas matzah, achilas matzah. So because you don't want to be maver al mitzvahs, you want to say the brachas in the order that they are in front of you. So you want to make sure that the top matzah over which you say, that the matzah over which you say hamaitzi, which is lechem mishnah, the whole matzah on the top, and of course the whole matzah on the bottom too, but the whole matzah on the top is that one should be on top. So hamaitzi comes first, followed by al achilas matzah on the middle matzah. So that's why it's put over there. The minhag is that the bigger half that you put away for the afikoimon is put in a towel or in cushions, in napkins, which is a reminder to misharoisam, to rurois, v'simloisam. The pasuk describes that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they had their dough wrapped in their clothing, in their fabrics as they left Egypt. So that's why the afikoimon is wrapped in a towel or a napkin, etc. There is also a minhag of stealing the afikoimon, which the original minhag was that the children would steal when the father was not looking. They would get around him and they would steal the afikoimon, and then they would bargain with him. And when it came time to eat it, they would say, "Well, I'm not going to give it back to you unless you do, and whatever. You buy me a suit, you buy me a Lego, whatever it is." And that was the original minhag, and Chabad don't do that minhag, and many poskim point out that it's not a very healthy way of educating children to teach them to steal and all that type of and dishonesty and things like that. I believe that the way many people in America do the minhag is a bit different. That the father hides it, and then whoever gets to find it gets a prize. So it's the minhag has been changed a little bit. All right, after Yachatz comes Magid. Now. Why is it called Magid? Magid is the same root as the word Haggadah, to tell the story to your child. Now, the first thing in our Magid is Holach Ma'anya. Some have the minhag to say Heilach Ma'anya. Our minhag is to say Holach Ma'anya, which is a section in the Haggadah which is not found in the Mishnah of the Gemara. So it's a later addition. What is Holach Ma'anya all about? So Holach Ma'anya includes 3 sections. The second section is inviting guests. Called Ditzrich Yesev Yisra, called Ditzrich Yesev, call Yesev Yechal, right? So you're inviting guests. The third section is Lashon Haba Barad Yisrael, with declaring your hope of redemption. We're not going to tonight focus too much on those two lines, but I do want to focus on the first line, which is Helach Ma'anya the Mitzrayim, talking about the bread. Now, the Gemara says, and Bill and Pesach and David Yehuda, you were with us when we learned this Gemara. That you grab matzah, that you choytev matzah. You choytev matzah on the Seder night. What does it mean to be choytev matzah? So there's four different interpretations of the Rishonim. Rashi says that choytev means that you lift the Seder plate. You lift the kaira to make sure the children don't sleep. So again, that's another thing that you're doing to keep the children involved. Rashi says, the Gemara says Shalai Yishnu, but in some Rishonim it says explicitly that you want the children to ask. The Maharil says this, and it's based on the Machzavitri, that you want the children to ask specifically, why have you lifted the plate? Right? And then, what do you answer them? You answer them, so whether you learn, like it's plain in the Gemara that they're not necessarily asking, you're just lifting it to show them, or it's even more than that, you lift it and you hope that they ask, and then you answer them. But what you're doing by Helach Ma'anya is you're lifting up the Seder plate, and you're saying, this is the bread. You're demonstrating, this is the bread that the matzah that our ancestors ate when they left Egypt. Now, our minhag is, Chabad minhag is, that we do not lift up the Seder plate. We just uncover the matzahs. Ari, what's your minhag? When it comes before Helach Ma'anya, do you pick up the Seder plate, or you just uncover the matzahs? You uncover the matzahs. So you don't lift the Seder. Gideon, what's your minhag? Do you lift up the Seder? You lift up the matzah. Yeah, okay, lift up the matzah. Do you lift up the matzah? Yeah. You do lift up the matzah, okay? So the common practice is that you do lift up the matzah. The Chabad minhag is that you don't lift up the matzah, you just uncover it. But the point is the same. Why are you uncovering the matzah? The point is to show the matzah to the people around you, specifically to the children, to show them the bread. Now, it's an interesting thing to point out that we keep the matzah uncovered for the duration of the recitation of the Haggadah. In other words, we're about to cover it back up, but then after Manishtana, you uncover the matzah and you keep it uncovered for the duration of most of the Haggadah. Why is the matzah uncovered for the duration of the Haggadah? It's uncovered because you're fulfilling the mitzvah of reciting the Haggadah over the matzah. Lechem she'einin olav dvarim. Right? But that's all for the rest of the Haggadah. For Helach Ma'anya, the reason why the matzah is uncovered is not because you're saying Helach Ma'anya over it, but it's more as a show to demonstrate, to be showing your children, this is the bread. So it's a different type of uncovering the matzah. The first one, uncovering the matzah, is in lieu of what's the more common minhag, to lift up the matzah. So we don't lift it up, we uncover it, but it's not the same as the uncovering for the rest of the Seder, which is there to facilitate reciting the Haggadah over the matzah.
Is that everyone's minhag to do that, to make sure that the matzah is uncovered? I'm just wanting to make sure I might be doing
I believe so, but we'll get up to that. That will be in part 2. You don't do that.
Yeah, most people keep it covered throughout. I think maybe.
Okay, so
but you're right. It seems that you should.
Okay, so Mitzvah Hashem in part 2, we'll get into that in more detail. Okay, the next thing it says in the Haggadah to do is to do 2 more things to get the kids riled up. Right, so you've already given them treats which they're not used to. You've already had your salad course, which they're not used to, according to the Rashbam. You've already lifted up your bread, which they're not used to. And now you're going to do another 2 things, and this is finally going to get them to ask the questions. What are the 2 things you're going to do? Number 1, you're going to remove the plate. You're going to remove the whole kaira with your matzah and everything on it. You're going to take it off the table. Right? Now that's very strange, because what is this kaira? This kaira is the food. We serve you your food, right? Usually you don't get served your food and take it away before you eat it. Right, so that's a very strange thing to do. You're going to remove the kaira from the table. Number 2 is you're going to pour a second cup of wine. Now, you need a second cup of wine because you're going to have a second cup of wine at the end of the Haggadah before you wash for matzah. You drink the second cup of wine. But for that purpose, you could just pour the cup of wine right then before you say Hallel, right? Before you say Lefichach. But we specifically pour the cup of wine now before the child's going to ask his questions, because that's another strange thing. He's used that you make Kiddush, and then after Kiddush, you eat the meal. You don't pour a second cup of wine until benching, right? If that. So you're pouring a second cup of wine, so you're doing another two things. You're pouring a second cup of wine, and you are removing the plate from the table. Now, it says in Shulchan Aruch that nowadays we do not remove the minhag is that you don't remove the Seder plate. And I would imagine, looking around the room, I got some strange looks before. I don't think anybody here has the minhag that before Manishtana you take the Seder plate off the table. And it says in Shulchan Aruch that the reason why you don't do that, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, the children know anyway that your main meal is not going to be out of this plate. In other words, once upon a time, the kaira, or in some places it's called the sal, the basket, you had your matzahs and you had your marer and your shteta and your cooked dishes, and that was everything you needed for the Seder was on that tray or in that basket, right? But nowadays the children already know that this is just the ritual kaira, but your actual meal is going to come later. So by removing the kaira from the table, you're not really going to get their attention, and so we no longer do that. So if you were doing the minhag that you raise the matzah for halach banya, now you put it down. If you were doing the minhag that you uncover the matzah for halach banya, now you cover it back up. But that's it. You just leave it covered, and we don't remove the plate from the Seder. And this leaves myself with the question, well, all of these things that we're doing in order to get the children to ask questions, well, we see here that we do change it a little bit. There was one thing that Gemara says you're supposed to do to get the children to ask questions, which you don't do anymore, because nowadays it wouldn't get them to ask the questions, which is removing the kaira from the table. So what about all the other things that we do that nowadays don't cause the kids to ask questions, primarily because they've already learned in school everything you're going to do? Okay, but Lamaisa, that remains I don't have any sort of genius answer to answer that question. As Ayidos, we remove the kaira from the table, or we don't. You pour the second cup of wine, and now the child is triggered and he's going to start asking questions. And that brings us a close to section 1 of this series, to be continued maybe Sunday morning, maybe next Monday night. We'll see exactly when part 2 is going to be. So make sure to look out for your messages.